There's three key principles, I think, that really stand out for me. And that's creating an environment of psychological safety, helping learners create those meaningful connections with learning, and also supporting learning transfer. So creating those opportunities. Exceptional learning environments make it okay to take risks and share ideas. This is an opportunity to learn, really making it a safe environment without judgment. I think that really opens the door for deeper engagement and learning. So that's the first one, psychological safety. And then meaningful connections. When we can link more to people's curiosity, their sense of purpose, to things that matter to them, to something that's emotionally stimulating to them, getting that emotional hook, that really helps make the brain prioritize the information and makes it more likely to stick. Then the third piece is really supporting learning transfer. When we learn, the goal ultimately is not just to know. We want to be able to apply what we learned in new and different situations in the real world. So that really means helping learners think about their learning and helping them practice applying the concepts.
Grace, I'm really excited to have you here today. I was so excited to get to meet you, especially given your background in neuroscience, behavioral science, your research-backed insights, and I'm really excited to dive into some of the topics around learning today with you.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk to you today, Vince.
Let's dive right in. I really want to get to some of the scientific insights you have. Generally, I would love to think about what makes learning really exceptional. Maybe we can start with top 2 to 3 scientific principles you know of that separate exceptional learning from ordinary learning.
That's actually a great question to kick off with. I think for learning to really be exceptional, you have to have the basics of what it takes to learn within the learning experience. So for example, we know that attention is important. It's the gateway to learning. If someone's not paying attention, no matter how great our learning is, they're not going to learn, right? If we don't have people's attention, we're not going to have ordinary learning, let alone exceptional learning. So we need things like that. And there's a lot of basic design principles we should follow based on how the brain works best and how it learns best. But beyond the basics, I think for learning to really be exceptional, to really take it to the next level, to elevate learners' experiences and the impact of learning, we have to do a couple of things. There's three key principles, I think, that really stand out for me. And that's really creating an environment of psychological safety, helping learners create those meaningful connections with learning, and also supporting learning transfer, so creating those opportunities. In terms of psychological safety, our brains are just wired for social connection. We're very sensitive to social connection, but we avoid risk when we feel threatened. So if learners don't feel safe, if they feel that they're going to be judged for their responses, or if they make a mistake, or they'll look silly or stupid, they'll hold back. Exceptional learning environments make it okay to take risks and share ideas. So you can imagine how that shows up in a group problem solving session where you could go in and just be scared to look silly in front of other people, right? But if you start out from the beginning, framing it as, we're going to make mistakes. This is an opportunity to learn, really making it a safe environment without judgment. I think that really opens the door for deeper engagement and learning. So that's the first one, psychological safety. And then the second, meaningful connections. I think that we're very driven by our emotion. So emotion drives our attention as well as our memory. So if training feels irrelevant, if it just seems blah to us, doesn't seem like anything we care about, the brain will tune out. When we can link more to people's curiosity, their sense of purpose, to things that matter to them, to something that's emotionally stimulating to them, that's when learning is more likely to stick because they're going to pay more attention, they're going to care more about the learning and do more with it. I know a lot of us work in compliance environments. Rather than saying, hey, these are the rules, you need to do it or else we'll get fined, it's really setting up the stage of this is why it matters. This is how it'll help you protect your reputation, your team's reputation. This is how it fits with your goals and the organization and team's goals, right? So really getting that emotional hook that really helps make the brain prioritize the information and makes it more likely to stick. Then the third piece is really supporting learning transfer. When we learn, the goal ultimately is not just to know. We don't just need to know a lot of information usually. A lot of times, most of the time, we want to be able to apply what we learned in new and different situations in the real world. So that really means helping learners think about their learning and helping them practice applying the concepts. concepts. For example, after teaching a concept, asking them questions that make them reflect, make them think about how would you do it in this situation? How would you transfer your learning in this situation? What would you do then? What are the blockers you would have? Making them do that kind of thinking makes them more flexible in their thinking and prepares them for real world challenges. I think really just the key point here is we need the basics, but I think to make something exceptional, you really have to think about what really adds on to the basics of learning.
That really resonates, and the context, the sense of connection, the environment matters a lot. Now, when you think about what L&D typically does today, like which insights, it could be something else from the ones you listed, but do you think very frequently get missed or abused? And like, why is that? Yeah, why does that happen?
I wouldn't point to just one specific insight. I think it's a more overarching gap. I think the biggest gap is that overall, even when organizations or L&D leaders know the learning science, they know the behavioral science, or are made aware of it, they don't always design with that learning science in mind and, with how our brains learn best. And there are a lot of reasons for why this happens, but it's still an issue regardless of the reason. So for example, we know that learning sticks best when it's spaced out over time. So the spacing effect, right? Where you have study sessions spaced out over time as opposed to cramming. I think we all have had that experience in school where we crammed information. That's not ideal. Ideally, you would space those study sessions out or even space out testing sessions, retrieval practice. Right? And so we know this. There's so much evidence out there in the research that supports this. But what organizations often do is they often default to one and done events, right? They expect a single workshop or a webinar or a class to make a drastic change. But science tells us that learning is a process, not just a singular event. But we're often treating learning as if it is something more like a singular event, like everything can be learned in a big event. I have an example of this. When I was formerly chief scientific officer of a company that consulted with a lot of L&D folks in Fortune 100 and 500 firms, we often talked about the importance about thinking about the holistic learning journey of learners. Not just thinking about this one thing they're trying to plan, but think about what else is going on, where are they starting from, what other courses, whatever other experiences they're having, and then also what's happening over time, what reinforcement's going to happen. So just really thinking about that broadly. They all love thinking about that. They all love talking about it. But even when they totally agreed and were totally bought in with that, a lot of times their organizations would still often default to more one and done events than they wanted to. And it's not because they didn't know that this was ideal. It's because of time and resource constraints, a lot of pressure. Yeah. I'm sure you've probably seen that, right?
I mean, I see a couple of things here. There's often, I think, a real tension between needing your people to focus their time on like getting the work done, feeling like it's taking time away from the work. So then there's a real trade-off happening. What's the minimum amount of like time you can dedicate to learning to get the maximum outcome? Definitely. But I think you end up making like wrong trade-offs that give you the illusion of learning being done, but it's a bunch of training that doesn't actually translate to learning.
You checked off the box, right? And that's the problem. Yeah. You checked off the box, but that didn't mean that you necessarily led to good, strong learning and that people could apply learning. So,
and then you get a lot of L&D, they get criticized for having no impact and like
So it's a circular problem, right? I think another example I like to give is cramming too much information into one session, right? We all know that we have a limited cognitive load, a limited amount we can handle at once, and that we won't learn effectively if we overload people. But oftentimes we still see these presentations that are, lots of information all up front. There's a lot of reasons for this. A lot of times it's pressure from stakeholders or subject matter experts who believe that this learning really needs to all happen now so they can get started now, right? And start doing something different now. The problem is that's not the way we learn. We know that the research says that, but we still do that. We also know that learners need active engagement and opportunities for application and reinforcement for learning transfer so that they actually change behaviors. But we still a lot of times have long slide decks, minimal interaction, a lot of passive learning. I think one of the pressures that gets in the way there is tradition. I think that is one challenge that a lot of organizations face is not only are they dealing with time and pressure, they're also hearing from a lot of stakeholders or subject matter experts who are saying, this is how I learned and look what a great position I'm in now. So this must be good learning, right? And that causes issues as well.
Yeah. For sure. What I've also seen is oftentimes business stakeholders would request a type of learning. They're like, hey, I need a 3-hour training on this. And they're requesting what they know. So they have a certain modality and solution in mind. And rarely is that the right thing. That back and forth becomes pretty challenging because many people feel like they know what good learning is because everyone has learned. The learning is
Right,
such a
everyone has, but we didn't always do it the right way, right?
so
Or the
that's
best way, I should say.
so I
I
guess
mean,
that's what you mean by tradition and the challenge.
yeah, I used to have all sorts of bad habits when I was younger. Now I'm a little horrified, but I'm sure we can all point to something that we did that wasn't ideal for learning. That often creates all sorts of pressures when we have to listen to different stakeholders. What happens is a lot of times, by checking off what this person says and that person says, we end up with a mishmash of learning, right? We should never lead with, oh, we want this modality. We should really be thinking, what is the cognitive experience people need to have? What is it that they need to get out of it? What mental models do they need to shift? What knowledge do they need to gain? What behavior changes need to happen? And work backwards to figure out what is the best way to deliver the learning that will have that impact. But we often don't work that way.
I love that. Could you describe maybe from a more like neuroscience angle, like when someone goes through an exceptional learning experience, what's going on inside the brain?
That's a great question. I'll start with what needs to happen for a learning experience, period. I don't think people realize how much has to happen at the brain level, how much has to be successful for you to actually get learning, right? Not to mention really exceptional learning. But by exceptional learning here, I'm thinking from a brain level, if you learn it, that's already pretty exceptional because a lot is forgotten. So we know that exceptional learning isn't just about memorizing facts. It's about creating lasting changes in the brain so you can use what you learned when it matters most. And there's a lot happening at the brain level to make this possible. So I already mentioned that attention is the gateway to learning. Your brain can't learn what it doesn't notice. And so attention acts kind of like a spotlight to direct your mental resources towards whatever you care about, whatever matters to you. From a neuroscience perspective, the prefrontal cortex at the very front of our brains, the structure that is especially well developed in humans, is the structure that's important for things like critical thinking. It's involved in decision making, maintaining focus, all those things. Well, it helps aim that spotlight of attention, helping us to prioritize what to focus on. And so what actually happens at the brain level is when something captures your attention, our brain will release dopamine, a chemical that signals salience, which just means that information stands out as noticeable in some way and potentially something we'll want to do something with. And then the dopamine can act on different brain areas, so it can affect the prefrontal cortex, essentially boosting your motivation and sharpening our focus, making it easier for us to focus, right? So that's really important because that way we can pay attention. And then when we pay attention, information enters the brain and can be held briefly. Now, what happens next is if we actively process the information in some way by elaborating, thinking about the meaning of what we're hearing or repeating it to ourselves or somehow connecting it with what we already know. So we're somehow manipulating the information in some way. We're engaging our working memory, which is our prefrontal cortex's kind of mental workspace where we can temporarily hold and manipulate information. And so it's a very active process. This kind of active processing, elaboration, linking it to what we already know, that creates conditions that makes it possible for the next step, encoding, to occur. Possibly. So there's a lot of possibly, right? There's a lot of things that can go wrong, but that allows encoding. And then if we have encoding, that's really the first big step towards developing long-lasting learning. So the hippocampus, a very important memory structure, basically acts like a binding hub. When we learn something, when we experience something, we take in things through different senses. So we hear something, we see something, we get lots of information from many places of input, right? What our hippocampus does is it binds that information together so it's a unified experience. So we can create a cohesive short-term memory trace. So it's like something that our brain can store as a memory that is cohesive, but it's temporary. It's a temporary representation of what you learned. It involves some short-term biological changes in how our neurons, our brain cells communicate with each other. It's the whole idea of, I'm sure we've all heard what fires together, wires together. That's the idea. That's what's happening. Essentially, the neurons that are involved in representing what's happening in the learning experience are active at the same time, and they're firing together at the same time. And it causes a short-term change in how they communicate. So it's strengthening the communication, the bonds between these neurons. But these memory traces are very fragile. So even if this encoding is successful, most of the information is still lost over time unless we undergo the next stage, which is consolidation. And that's where we really can make learning stick. So it's the process of stabilizing that fragile short-term memory trace and really transforming it into a long-term memory. And it just involves more biological changes, more permanent things like protein synthesis. We have structural remodeling. So there's physical changes to the brain cells. And all these changes basically strengthen and reorganize the pathway. So the connection of neurons that are communicating with each other. And again, the hippocampus is very involved in this process too. So the hippocampus was involved in encoding and consolidation. The important point though is that once consolidation occurs, if it's successful, then we have a stable long-term memory and we can use it later on, years later, possibly. But consolidation takes time. Some of it begins soon after learning, while other parts can take days, weeks, months, even years. And that's why we need things like reinforcement, why it's so important to space out learning, space out practice, all of that, because that helps with consolidation. You can kind of think about it like upgrading a road system, right? Encoding is like having that narrow dirt pathway, a weak connection. So you've made a connection between neurons, right, in the learning experience. But with consolidation, with practice and recall, your brain is adding extra lanes, building sturdier roads, bridges, turning that path into faster, more reliable highway. So that's why the more we revisit ideas over time, the more likely we're going to consolidate it and have it as a lasting memory. So that's those are the basic processes that have to happen. And if you think about it, it's a lot. A lot has to go right for learning. So in my mind, that is pretty extraordinary when it does work. But there are obviously other things that add to that and influence that as well.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I was like, that's so cool. As you describe it, the way I would distill like what I took away from it is, first of all, learning is a pretty effortful process. There's a lot of energy being expended like in order to make all of these things happen. The two things that seem to be very important is, to your point, one, you have to be willing to pay attention, which means you got to be motivated. And two, you got to be actively processing. You somehow need to get people to keep on extending effort, but be motivated to do it when they have many other things that compete for their attention. It's sort of like the core of learning. But then if you recognize that's what learning is, and then you look at the typical learning that's get deployed at corporate learning, you're like, it's so far from how the brain actually learns. Like typical corporate learning seems to be really built around no effort, just make it as like seamless as possible. And also not necessarily very motivating for people to really engage. So then it's no wonder it's not really translating to any real on-the-job impact.
Yeah, and it's tough because real learning is difficult because, obviously there's learning in the flow of work, but when we're talking learning experiences like courses or things like that, people are taking time out, like you said, to do this, right? And that's why we often have trouble with people multitasking and things like that. They have so much else going on, especially if you're client facing. They are under all this pressure to do all these other things. It's really hard for them to focus on the learning, and it's problematic. And at the same time, the other point you made about effort, yes. One of the problems is that if you ask learners what they want, they will tell you what they want in learning, but that is not necessarily the approach you want to take because learners may not really understand what makes for good learning. And some of our instincts are actually against what makes for good learning. If you ask people, no one likes to be tested, but testing is actually good for your learning, right? So those are things that we have to consider.
Now, speaking of that, I want to move a little bit onto the concept of social learning. You and I had talked about this, and I know you've done some studies around social learning, core learning, and so on. Can you describe, first of all, why social learning or core-based learning can be so powerful?
I think a lot of it has to do with the brain inherently, right? We are inherently social creatures. There's a whole sense of our survival historically was somewhat dependent on our social connections. You needed social connections to have resources, right? To have protection and safety. And that's why our brains are wired to be so highly sensitive to social cues, inclusion, recognition, and belonging. Because of that, our brain is already set up for really wanting social learning. And then social learning has a lot of aspects about it that can be used for learning purposes. So anything social is so important to us. And I think if we think about some of the experiments that have been done on this, it really kind of points to the importance of that social aspect, right? There's evidence from research that, on the one hand, social exclusion hurts. It's painful in some ways. And on the other hand, social connection is rewarding. We actually have more dopamine release, which also helps our learning. And we just talked about how dopamine can help with focus and all sorts of other things. A lot of that has to do with why social learning is so useful for us. So the social exclusion studies I'm thinking about, it's actually kind of interesting. I don't know if you've heard about the cyberball experiments. It's these experiments where they put people in an fMRI scanner and they think they're playing a game of virtual catch with other people. What they don't know is the researcher is controlling the game,
Mm.
right? And they have their hand represented when they're with these other two people and they're throwing back and forth. But all of a sudden, they stop throwing to this person. And so they're like, their little hand, it's so funny because you see it, their little hand is waving on the screen like, what about me? What about me, right? It's not surprising. People feel rejected. They feel like they were left out in some way. But that's not surprising. But what's fascinating is that the brain scans showed increased activity in the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula, areas that are involved in emotional pain, and some of the same pathways as physical pain. So even though social pain isn't identical to physical pain, it shares some neural circuits. That just really underscores how important the sense of belonging, social inclusion, all that is to us. We know that social rejection also impairs cognition as well. When we're rejected, our threat systems become more active, and then we start to allocate cognitive resources to dealing with the threat, which means we're not able to do other kinds of thinking like critical thinking as well. In that sense, we can see what happens when you don't have good social connections. When you, on the flip side, do have good social connections, when we feel recognized and included, our brain's reward system becomes more active. The ventral tegmental area releases more dopamine to another area, the nucleus accumbens, and it creates pleasure, boosts motivation, reinforces behaviors. So in other words, social connection just feels rewarding in a lot of ways, like food or some other basic necessity would be rewarding. And so when we design those learning experiences that are social, we're really tapping into something fundamental.
That's interesting. And tying back to the initial insights you were sharing, part of it is making sure you're motivated. And when you're social, you inherently are more motivated. There's something I've felt in the past, and I'm curious if this is also some cognitive process that's going on. If I were to get a fact presented to me, fact was something I just read versus someone I trust in some way like told me. I think the amount to which it sticks in my brain and it actually influences me to act differently is very different. And so I'm curious what's going on there. Why does learning seem to stick more, at least from my perception perspective, when it's through a conversation and interaction rather than me just working on something on my own?
Yeah, there could be a lot of reasons for that. For one thing, when you're talking to a trusted source, that in itself prioritizes what you're hearing more than if you just read it somewhere. Our brain does a lot of prioritizing that we don't even realize. So for example, if you have something that is strongly emotional, our amygdala, I know everyone thinks of the amygdala as the fight or flight, only deals with threat, but it actually is involved in positive emotion, in other emotions as well. But basically when you have strong emotions, negative or positive, the amygdala becomes more active and it can basically send a signal to other parts of your brain, that are involved in learning and memory, the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, other areas, and say, hey, this is extra important. You might want to pay extra attention to this. So there are those aspects. And I think when you talk to a trusted source, there's a lot that's going on. One is that you trust them more, so that makes you more likely to take it in. But I think the other aspect, especially in social interactions, a lot of times these conversations are actually, you feel like they're useful. There's some positive aspect of them. Like, I don't know if you've ever had those conversations, Vince, where you're just having a random conversation with someone and you're just sharing a lot of ideas and it's like, wow, this is really cool. That kind of positive collaboration also will cause this kind of tagging as, hey, pay attention to this because it's more important. So there's a lot of things that probably contribute to that.
Got it. Well, my brain definitely is currently saying this collaboration is very useful and pay attention to this conversation right now. Very interesting. Okay, so I want to move to now, we can't escape this conversation. There's all these platforms that are coming out that are basically saying, instead of you talking to a coach, you can talk to an AI to role play, or like AI taking this role and trying to replace the human element in the experience and saying we can get so close to almost a human and solve sort of the 3 sigma or 2 sigma problem. So curious, what's your take on that?
Yeah, it's tough because I think AI does a lot of phenomenal things, right? I think it is fantastic at the how of things. I think it can help us personalize things at scale in a way that there's no way us humans could do it, right? They adapt content to match each learner's pace and prior knowledge. And that's very helpful because we know since people are limited in their time and attention, we want to meet them where they are, have the right level of difficulty in whatever they have to learn. So I think that AI does a great job with that kind of thing. I think where AI struggles is more with the why of learning. It can literally explain the why. You can ask Copilot why something and it'll give you an answer. I think it can't replace the human connection and meaning behind why. It's not quite tangible. It's hard to even put into words, but it can say why something is important, but it's not the same. that trust, empathy, that shared experience we have with other people, all those things that can create psychological safety, which is the foundation for risk taking and deep learning. AI can simulate some aspects of that. It's great at giving feedback. It's great at saying things to you, but really that authentic trust, that sense of belonging, I think they remain uniquely human. While AI can deliver certain content, it can definitely direct you in this direction. It can give you feedback to your answers. It can tell you where to go, things like that. I think there's an aspect that it can't quite replicate. The encouragement that you get from a peer, a mentor, that sense of belonging, all that kind of belongingness that truly inspires transformation. That's my thought. I know you and I have talked about this a little bit, so I'd love to hear your thoughts, Vince. You and I were talking about the pros and cons of using AI facilitators and concerns and all that.
Of course, there are a lot of really powerful and interesting thing about AI. But go back to what you said earlier. I think there's an inherent level of motivation and engagement when you're talking to another human, interacting with another human.
And that is true. By the way, there is actually research that shows that the reward areas of our brain are more active, more dopamine release when we're interacting with a human than an AI bot or something like that.
So when you look at an average person, let's say with an average level of motivation, if they're learning with other humans, you're likely to be able to activate them to really pay attention and put in the energy. But if you put an average person in front of an AI bot and say, hey, use this AI bot to go practice your difficult conversation or master, they'll be like, why would I try in front of a bot? It doesn't matter. I think that's the fundamental challenge probably. I do think there are going to be people who, if they are so motivated already, they don't need the human element for them to show up fully, and they can use AI to really practice, because I think AI can give you all the right answers. But it's not about just the right answer. It's actually the buy-in, excitement, the willingness to engage. And I think that's what's very difficult about a non-human engaging with a human.
Yeah, I think all of us at some point in our lives can point to someone who made an impact. Might have been a former mentor, might have been a teacher, might have been a classmate. And I think that kind of impact that they had is a little bit harder to program into an AI that predicts things and decides what to say next based on patterns, right? I think it's kind of two problems that we're talking about here. One is the problem of AI's limitations and what it can do. It's great at a lot of this technical stuff. And like you said, some learners, especially for certain types of learning, there's certain types of learning you don't need as much social as other types, like highly technical learning where you learn at your own pace. It's less necessary. So there's some learning that you don't need it as much, but AI can do quite a bit, but it does have some things it can't do. One problem is just the issue with AI not being able to do certain things. But then the other part that you brought up is how people respond to humans versus AI differently as well. There's coming from that side of things, there's definitely a difference. I know that a lot of people want to use AI facilitators, and I think they can be good for certain things, but I think it ultimately comes down to what is your real goal here? What are you trying to get people to do? And is it better or worse if you do it this way versus that way? So
definitely. Okay, so maybe the last question for you, thinking through all the different conversations we've had about what great learning looks like, how our brain learns, and what you've seen in most organizations. What's your one or two top pieces of advice you would give to an L&D professional today and driving greater impact in their organization?
Yeah, I think it would be pausing regularly when you're doing things and questioning, right? Because I think too often, especially when we're under time and budget pressure, and we've got this stakeholder in this year, this stakeholder in this year, we've got so much stuff going on and we're trying to check all the boxes. That's when we get into following certain traditions, doing things a certain way that may not serve the purpose, right? I think really figuring out is what is it that we're trying to get the people to learn, right? What do they need to be able to do? What do they need to get from the experience? Working backwards from there. And then regularly checking in with ourselves, pausing to check in with ourselves and say, have we strayed too far from that? So having that North Star, I think, is really important, because otherwise, with all the pressures, you can very quickly start veering off and doing things that don't make sense for how people learn what we know in the behavioral sciences. And it's not that it's intended. It's just that, there's just so much going on. There's so much noise. Pause, I think, is really important. And it's probably one of the hardest things to do in our busy world.
Especially when you're getting all these requests from different leaders and they're saying, I want this yesterday.
Yep.
So oftentimes business leaders would be frustrated when you try to reframe and do the right thing, right? Not do the thing they asked for, but actually solve the right problem. So you need to be savvy in managing that stakeholder to understand why you're doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it is honestly because it's not that they don't want what's good, but they have their own pressures, right? They have their own things that they have to focus on for the business. And so it makes sense that they're pressuring you. And at the same time, they don't necessarily understand the science, right? And why you wouldn't do certain things a certain way. They might see short, splashy videos and it's like, oh, yeah, let's do that. That's a great idea. Which, part of it is kind of education as well as also, being very clear about what does and doesn't work and how certain compromises are okay, but certain compromises are not okay, right? And they will affect people being able to use this information the way you want them to be able to use it. So, but to be able to do that, even we have to pause as L&D professionals to even recognize that we're going off the rails in some way. So.
Yeah. Grace, I love diving into the real neuroscience of it. And it was really sort of enlightening to think about it from this angle. Thanks so much for sharing your insights today.
Yeah, no, it was great talking to you again, Vince, always. So
Yeah,
thank
and
you.
hopefully this is the start of more conversations like this.
Yeah, that would be great.
Thank you.